It is my great pleasure to open the second day of our symposium. It's going to be a long day, like yesterday, and tiring, but I hope you're in good condition to hear our second plenary lecture, which will be delivered by Michael Toolan. Michael is well known to very many of us, but still I have to present his short biographical note. Michael is Professor of English Language in the Department of English Language and Linguistics at the University of Birmingham. He studied at the University of Edinburgh for his MA and St. John's College, Oxford for his PhD. And then taught at the National University of Singapore and the University of Washington, Seattle, before coming to Birmingham. Well, he's a prolific writer, I must say, and I wonder how on earth you found time to produce all those books. So I'm going only to mention the most important ones. Narrative, a critical linguistic introduction, 1988, and the second edition came out in 2001. And the Stylistics of Fiction, a literary linguistic approach, 1990. Total Speech, an integrational linguistic approach to language, 1996. Language in Literature, an introduction to stylistics, 1997. Narrative Progression in the Short Story, a corpus stylistic approach, 2009. And most recently, Making Sense of Narrative Text, Situation, Repetition, and Picturing, which appeared from Routledge in 2016, and he hopes that the language of inequality in the news, a critical discourse analysis approach, will appear later this year from Cambridge University Press. Michael has been the editor of the Journal of Literary Semantics since 2002, continuously, and from 2006 to 2014 served as president of the International Association of Literary Semantics. He is currently chair of PALA, that is Poetics and Linguistics Association. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elżbieta. Thank you very much, Elżbieta. I hope everyone can hear me. I have a mic here, so it should be audible. Let me first thank Elżbieta for inviting me here. It's such an honor to come back to Kraków and talk at this conference. And to thank Elżbieta, Michał, Richard, and all of the local team for the terrific job they're doing in having organized and running this conference so smoothly and giving us so many interesting experiences. So let's thank everyone, shall we? To go off my own script very briefly, when Elżbieta mentioned that first book in stylistics I published called Narrative, it reminded me of the fact that I got that task of writing that book, Narrative, a critical linguistic introduction, because Professor Ron Carter effectively commissioned me to do it, as he did with a number of then young academics who were sort of starting out. Ron made a big difference in encouraging us and enabling us, and so it's with great sadness that we learned of Ron's death just a few weeks ago. And I just wanted to mention in passing what a wonderful colleague, academic, inspiration he was in the many fields to which he contributed. Okay, my talk today is, as you can see, it's on seeing as, hearing as, reading as, and so on, and I will try and talk to my slides rather than reading a document, although I do have a document here which I might refer to briefly. My interest is in our human appetite, in the arts particularly, for seeing, interpreting, and talking about instances of art that comes to us in one form, for example, sculpture, in the terms of a different mode, such as poetry. And this is why I'm using the phrase seeing as. There's a wonderful quote from Peter Rabinowitz in the book called Narrative Across Media that came out a few years ago. His article in that collection at one point mentions that, as far as he's concerned, reading, and just to quote him, reading, and I'm using that term broadly to include listening and viewing, is always reading as. And I think that's the the reason why I'm also wanting to emphasize seeing as. So here's the broad structure of my talk. A few remarks on seeing as, different forms of seeing as. A few examples of ekphrasis, which I see as one kind of seeing as. Some discussion of how some listeners, not all, listening to instrumental, non-linguistic music, music with no language element to it, seem to see or hear a story of some sort as they're listening to that piece. However vague the story is, however divergent it might be from other people's stories, the stories that other people compose in their heads as they're listening to that music. Then I'll report some interesting evidence from an MA student of mine from last year who played a couple of short extracts of music, instrumental music, to participants, informants, and recorded their responses and tried not to ask a leading question like, do you hear a story when, or whatever. You know, she tried to be quite neutral in how she probed their reactions, their responses to the music. Then I'll talk a little bit about how some of the ways in which I see music as as having narrative properties, but also having some properties which are not narrative-like. And then I raise a paradox at the very end. So let's get on with some examples. Certainly one version of this seeing as conversion for me is ekphrasis, which I regard as a conversion or metaphorizing in which a pictorial or imagistic artwork is reconceived in something verbal and very often something written. So the unified fixity, we might say, of pictorial representation is supplemented or displaced by the intrinsically sequential distributed representation of language, because once, of course, you get into language, you're getting into sequence. Historically, ekphrasis, the key word in ekphrasis is the idea of description. Ekphrasis is etymologically a describing or proclaiming in speech of something that in itself cannot speak, such as a painting, because it's inanimate, it's voiceless. So from that I take the idea that what ekphrasis tells us is that you can make a story, you can give a voice and a story from a painting or a sculpture or a photograph. And as you'll see later, I will also argue that you can say the same about music. It can induce you as hearer to make a story. I want to be guarded about saying whether the story is in the music, but certainly in the listening to the music, very often we make a story. Staying with ekphrasis a little longer, consider José Ribera's painting of Isaac and Jacob in the Prado in Madrid, which I saw a couple of years ago and made quite an impression on me. Like many other paintings, I think Ribera's Isaac and Jacob provokes ekphrasis, and that makes me think that ekphrasis must be one of the most powerful begetters of poetry in existence. Here it is. Here's the painting, 1637. And shamelessly, I will now read to you my poem about it. It's so easy nowadays to get them confused. Which one's the foolish father? Which the smooth? Which the hairy one? But there they all are, captured in widescreen by Di Ribeiro. On the right, but in the wrong, Isaac fills half the canvas in his womb of red silk, muscular arms extended so he can feel Jacob's impossibly hairy one, lambskin as downy as a swan's. There's arthritis in Ike's hand, but who's been painting his toes? Who tends his prophet's Nobel laureate beard? Who wields the knife on the meat in his bedside collation, conveniently in reach? How stupid he is, and how pudgily self-absorbed is the son's cheating face in profile. On the marginal far left, the downturn of Esau's mouth confirms his difference. With only grey clouds ahead and hands like limp paddles carrying nothing special in a knotted cloth on a stick, he knows to sling his hook and seek austerity's cold embrace elsewhere. But the mother, in her Puritan black serge and hair-hiding mob cap, intervening between her sons, has her eye on us and our condescending disapproval. What do we know of her life, her fate, Her dark-tinged eye asks what business it is of ours. Though tight-lipped, feigning neutrality and saying nothing, her long pianist's fingers propel Jacob and his Tory blue jerkin towards the bedbound elder and signal his election. Only from close by can we see she's conflicted, a sinner like us, troubled by this son on the make, and poor Esau, missing below the waist entirely, her eye shamed by the taste and smell of lying to a blind man. So I just give that an example of how I think many times when we encounter one form of art, we are impelled, we're prompted, we're excited almost to think of it in the terms of another art form. Another example of this mode crossing seeing as or reading as, of course, is personification. And I've been teaching Elizabeth Bishop's poetry this term, and it's quite striking that in Elizabeth Bishop, who I think of often as a very laid-back, very relaxed poet, not striving for complicated metaphors, quite happy to write a poem about a map, which is all about maps, nothing else. Even in Elizabeth Bishop, we do see plenty of personification in her supposedly non-florid poetry. Here's a poem of hers, famous poem of hers called A Cold Spring, which in part is an intertextual response to Hopkins. And it begins with these clear examples of personification. A cold spring, the violet was floored on the lawn. For 2 weeks or more, the trees hesitated. The little leaves waited, carefully indicating their characteristics. Finally, a grave green dust settled over your big and aimless hills. So everywhere I look, I find these processes of seeing or saying or painting one thing as if it were another. And I suggest it's a very deeply embedded cognitive resource that we use for all kinds of purposes, and we see different, as it were, emanations of it or instantiations of it in things like ekphrasis, synesthesia, translation and interpreting, metaphor and metaphoricity, and personification. The seeing often involves bringing language to otherwise a languageless art form. And I think sometimes the language we bring takes a narrative form. Another example is a famous anecdote about William Faulkner. When he was writer-in-residence towards the end of his life at the University of Virginia, he was asked by the graduate students about his novel, The Sound and the Fury, which seems to be all about Caddy Compson, but he does, and as you probably remember, it's told in 4 parts, but none of the parts is told from Caddy's point of view. And he's asked by one of the students, as you can see the question here, Mr. Faulkner, the first 3 sections of that book are narrated by one of the 4 Compson children, and in view of the fact that Caddy figures so prominently, is there any particular reason why you didn't have a section with her views, her impressions? That's a good question, says William Faulkner. The explanation of that whole big book is in that. It began with the picture of the little girl's muddy drawers climbing that tree to look in the parlour window with her brothers that didn't have the courage to climb the tree, waiting to see what she saw. And Faulkner came back to this idea of Caddy up the tree, looking in, being a lot braver than her brothers, many times. So in a sense, you could argue that The Sound and the Fury, this wonderful novel, began with a picture, a mental picture that Faulkner himself had. Another little anecdote about Sound and the Fury, Faulkner always wanted it to be printed in different colours for the different sections, but of course the publishers said that was too expensive, and that's often a constraint on our multimodality, I think, publishers' interests. To summarise so far, I think we find it enormously useful sense-making exercise to see or interpret or reimagine the artwork we are encountering in terms of some other medium or mode. The seeing as may take the form of a scene or an image or a picture. The picture may be shifting, it may be maximally vague and revisable. And for the person imagining the picture may also itself evoke or imply a story. And now I come to music, because music for me is another of these examples where I think there's a kind of seeing as conversion. that occurs when individual members of a concert audience, hearing purely instrumental music, are inclined to narrativize it in the course of listening. And I believe this experiencing the work as a kind of story helps them make sense of the music, helps them enter into the world of the music and be cognitively and emotionally engaged or immersed. Just to remind you, what I mean by music here is something, a rough definition, human-produced sounds in rhythmic sequence, scripted and prepared or unscripted and unprepared, maybe spontaneous, it may be improvised, that are devoid of any verbal accompaniment. So I'm not interested here in songs with words or with opera, so-called program music, compositions with a story implicating title. I think it's no surprise that listeners find stories in those kinds of works. I'm more interested in the person listening to music who's told, right, this piece is opus 32. That's all they're told. And they, as they're listening, they start to narrativize. And here now I'll turn to this MA student of mine from last year who did an MA dissertation on this topic of musical narrativity. And here I'll summarize what she did. First of all, she played to a small body of participants. First, a small extract from the Elgar Cello Concerto, followed later by an extract from a Brian Eno composition, or the other way around. So she mixed the order in which they were presented to the participants. And then she asked the participant, when you listened to that piece of music, did any picture come to mind? So she was asking about pictures rather than narratives. After their initial response, a follow-up question was asked, did any words or phrases come to mind? Because we wanted the respondents to verbalize. And we certainly hoped that some phrases might contain connections or transformations implicating events, implicating something of the quality of narrative, which of course involves a situation and change to that situation. Then there was point 5, there was a check to make sure, or try to ensure that the participant was unaware of the true aim of the study. And then Olivia coded the responses for presence or absence of several key narrative features, what she regarded as key narrative features. So she was looking for words, phrases that she would regard as relating to key narrative features, such as, listed there, temporality and subtypes of temporality, sequence, anachrony, emphasis on journeys or travelling, or emphasis, for that matter, on staticness, stillness. 3 features in particular she was looking for: events and evaluation, temporality, and character and setting. And what was one of the striking findings, I'll show you 1 or 2 more, was that 7 of the 10 participants who were asked to listen to the Elgar referred to 2 or more events in their comments on the Elgar extract. They clearly also had a strong sense of sequence when they commented on these pieces. Now, I'm not sure if I have time. I probably do have time, so I might, at this stage, try to play you a little bit of this, just to remind you, they didn't have a long they have a long extract. I mean, presentationally, you know, there are challenges here. You know, you can't get 20 participants, certainly individually, to sit down and listen to the whole Elgar Cello Concerto and then respond. It's very hard to, anyway, especially if you're doing an MA thesis. So she gave them quite a short clip of it, and I'm just going to play you a little of it, just to remind you of what it sounds like. Some of you may have been in Marta Falcao's presentation yesterday afternoon, so you may have heard this already, but I'll try and get to the beginning of it, because it's horrible to miss the very beginning. I better stop. One could go on. It's very hard to stop Elgar once it starts, isn't it? I would want to say a couple of things too. What you've seen, of course, is Jacqueline Dupre and Daniel Barenboim, and those of us of a certain vintage remember when they were, young like that. And when we see it, maybe all kinds of other associations are sort of the Romeo and Juliet story of these great musicians come to. Now, none of that did Olivia prime her informants with, because she gave them only the recording, not the YouTube clip, right? So I want to emphasize that. She just gave them the music, and I think, I'm sorry I should have checked this, but I think she established that none of them knew the piece already. And as you can see, she didn't give them a whole lot of it. So she gave them about 3 minutes for each of those two pieces, and then she asked them those questions that I mentioned to you. So when you listen to that piece, did any picture come to mind? And I'll just give you one or two of the informant's responses. Here's informant number 6. I won't read the first paragraph, but the first paragraph ends with the informant saying, yeah, I didn't get a clear picture, but it felt like sort of an individual. That's what I sort of saw in my mind. And then the interviewer says, and any words or phrases? Yeah, sort of to me it seems like a sort of emotional journey as the piece grows. And it starts off quite thin and then builds, and there's lots more things coming in. To me it seems like someone like ruminating to themselves, and at first it sounds a little angry, like annoyed or distrustful. And then it's like as more things are coming on, they're having loads of different thoughts in their heads. And it made me feel like by the end it was really powerful, like regret, anger, frustration, like as if someone's letting negative thoughts run in their head. And another informant. So when you listen to that piece of music, did any picture come to mind? Like a picture of a scene or something? It sounded quite like a ballet. So I was picturing, in my head, I was picturing a scene from a ballet, and I was imagining what could be happening. And then the speaker goes on to say, well, in my head, it was like the protagonist, or whoever the character, who for some reason was male, was like in a very sad situation, and like they do use like a lot, don't they? And like realizing something, he was realizing something about the situation and a kind of like wrongdoing that had been done to him. It was like realization of betrayal, and it was the learning, the awakening of this knowledge upon him. And it was almost kind of like the anger, he was becoming angry, and it was almost the climax, the crescendo was him fully realizing what was happening, and his anger reached its most heightened point. He became so angry and decided to take action. I think when you see these, there's a certain familiarity about them, isn't there? I think we're familiar with, intuitively, with people responding in these really quite narrativized ways. So what she found was that in a lot of the responses, people talked about sequence, they talked about progression, they talked about change, they talked about journeys and traveling. The skeptic inside me says, journeys, traveling, yeah, everyone's talking about journeys. Everyone's on a journey these days, for God's sake. But getting to the more particularities of it, some of her participants, 6 of her 10 participants, imagined a character being involved in the music they heard. So one of them talked about a picture of 2 lovers accepting some kind of fate. Someone else thought it was like one person on their own. And the third person said it was a lady going around the streets with a man following. Well, 7 of the 20 participants suggested a place or setting, and a smaller group of the participants also focused on time. They were trying to locate this at a particular place and a particular time for some reason. And Olivia suggests that was because they were, in a sense, responding to the way we often respond to a narrative that we're trying to make sense of. We try to nail down, the didactic specifics of it, where it happened, when it happened. So certainly, she argues, a certain amount of narrative thinking is evident in these participants' responses to this Elgar piece. And her final thoughts, I think, are very restrained. And this is a direct quote from her thesis. I would argue that it's not the music itself that provides the narrativity, but rather that listeners interpret music in a narrative way in order to understand a deeper meaning to the piece. I like the "in order to." What is overwhelmingly clear from this study is the range of interpretations given by individuals in response to the same pieces. Some contain multiple narrative features, and some do not contain any, but most did contain some narrative features. Now I want, in the rest of the talk, to talk a little bit about Similarities and differences between music and verbal narrative. Both are intrinsically sequential, temporal. But I think anachrony is an interesting phenomenon because we expect it in so many kinds of narrative these days. Not all narratives, we expect it in quite a number of narratives. Proleptic, flash forwards, jumping forward, or an analepsis, telling later what happened earlier. And this anachrony of presentation seems hard or even impossible to achieve in the musical sequence, the sequence of music. Even in opera, I think it's quite hard to find operas where you get proleptic or analeptic jumps or temporal reordering of that kind. And I think there are good reasons for that, but I won't go into them now. You need events in order to have anachrony, so that you can move the events around. So then your question arises, do we have events in music? Maybe that's why we can't do anachrony in music. And I think, of course, it depends on what we define as an event. Many people argue that there are no events in music, and that's probably, this is a kind of a crux, I think. On the other hand, many listeners, critics, performers will refer to a number of moments in a piece of music as moments or passages in which something happens that is noticeably distinct from most of what precedes and most of what follows. Even without benefit of much musicological language, ordinary people may talk about these moments or passages of change and development at the time or in their discussion afterwards. They may key it to particular instruments, but not inevitably. Anyway, I almost entitled this slide, "In any event," but I thought that was a bit too... Anyway, events are necessary, but they're not sufficient for anachronic presentation. And there are lots of narratives we know. Children's narratives, for example, often have little or no anachronic presentation. They just give you one thing after another in a steady chronology. So although anachronic presentation might be regarded as a good measure of so-called full narrativity, you know, this sort of richest narrativity, nevertheless, I think we can say that there are narratives that don't have anachronic presentation and that anachronic presentation is not required for something to count as a narrative. Only connect, E.M. Forster urged us, and sometimes I think it's more a matter if only we could connect. But in fact, I think we're trying to do so all the time in making sense of narratives and in making sense of other arts, such as painting and music. And we use cross-modal resources, such as narrativity, in trying to do that connecting, that apprehending of the art form in its multimodal or synesthetic integrated combination. Another objection to seeing narratives in music is to say that music cannot have intentionality, it cannot be about something. Music is pure sound, some people say, and it's languageless sound. Thus, it can have no meaning. But to me, sounds are never encountered divorced from all context. Quite hard for me to think of something that really constitutes pure sound. In experience, sound is always in some context or other, and within contexts, suddenly so-called pure sounds begin to accrete meanings. Another point that people often make is that although music is non-propositional, it's very good at evoking the emotions. And again, it feels to me as if that's detaching emotions from contexts, from narratives. Are the emotions evoked in performers or listeners without an anchorage, a contextual situatedness? I would say not. However vaguely done, the emotions triggered by a passage of music are attached to one or more participants in some imagined setting. For example, an emotion-heavy story. If we talk about a passage of Schumann and say that it evokes nostalgia or grief for a lost innocence, we're assuming, I believe, that the grief is being experienced by a human being, often ourselves or someone like us, and not anything else, animate or inanimate. So emotions brought to mind in and by music are actually miniature, emotion-heavy narratives brought to mind. Admittedly, maximally vague and impermanent. They fade away fairly rapidly. So now I want to suggest one of the ways in which we might see a kind of narrative quality in instrumental music, and that's to do with over and above events. I think in addition we could argue that people reasonably interpret the instruments of a musical piece as characters or like characters. The use of instruments as voices is very common to call an instrument a voice. Carrying a melody or answering it, brought forward in the composition or moved into the background, taking the lead or following others, is music's solution to the problem of narrative dramatization. As you know, our narrative preference is for one or more human or quasi-human agonists, and the counterpart in music is the human singing voice, or by a further remove, the musical instrument. So I treat the human voice as the sort of the foundational instrument, and then other musical instruments as a kind of extensions of the human voice. The wordless musical line of a performer or instrument is akin to the interacting of a character on a stage in a narrative drama. Each musical line is a voice, and the voice is metonymic of a character. And then we have things like whole sections, you know, all the first violins. How can they be a character? Or indeed the whole orchestra. But I think if you think about a group of violins playing in unison and comprising one voice, arguably they can, in a sense, constitute one collective character, and it's not so different from the chorus in some plays, the collective voice of a crowd in an opera, or narratorial reports in 19th century novels or 18th century novels of the general sentiment of the town or the village. So there are complications, and then that we certainly have to distinguish between things like the orchestra, where you certainly have a strong sense of background and foreground, and other kinds of things like the quartet or a sonata, where all the characters are lead characters. But that's, I think, no different from what we find in drama or in novels, actually. So if, for some listeners, music has individual characters in a story situation by virtue of the most prominent instruments' voices, those instruments are the chief source for a work's non-propositional, in inverted commas, events. Not every instrumental line needs to be prominent. As on the stage and in the novel, there may be leading roles and background figures, and this business of the main characters and background, I think, is quite difficult to translate into the situation of music, but I think it can be done. I'll move on to the next slide, I think. I'm very near the end now, because here's a paradox I want to... good, I've got plenty of time. A paradox I began to think of more and more, because when I started to write this talk, I was also thinking about another problem I find when I'm looking at so-called multimodal pieces or integrated pieces, such as Elgar's Dream of Gerontius. Elgar's Dream of Gerontius has the wonderful poem by John Henry Newman, a poem about the final hours of Gerontius, who dies and prepares to meet his maker, which inspired Elgar. So there you have again this sort of transmodal inspiration, that a poem inspires Elgar to write a whole oratorio called The Dream of Gerontius. And the dilemma for me as an analyst is how we can grapple with these multimodal pieces. We're very good in stylistics at taking a poem and analysing it, transcribing it, and annotating it in many different ways, because the poem itself is already, or we think of it as already, you know, a written, defined, monomodal product. But when you have something which is using multiple modes, like theatre, or like music with a verbal component, we struggle, I think. So the difficulty, I think, is for as analysts, not as listeners, experiencing listeners, but as analysts, in holding everything together, capturing, transcribing. We go in for transcription straight away, but what should we be transcribing, and how do we put it all together? Other than using things like something like the format of a score, or multiple columns down the page or whatever, for these different kinds of performance. None of it seems to be particularly satisfactory as a way of representing for analysis the multimodal or synesthetic integrated whole. So, as that's the second paragraph here, our academic analytical efforts to capture the multimodal or synesthetic combination, to me, do not seem satisfactory. I think, you know, we make attempts, but we find it's terribly difficult, I think, to tie together even things like text and image, never mind text and moving image or text and moving music. We develop databases and charts that look a little like orchestral scores or screenplays, but their monomodal attempt to transcribe and annotate everything in writing seems to fail adequately to represent, and perhaps they inevitably fail adequately to represent. So we hit a kind of wall, I think, in our analyses. So now I'm just going to summarize what I've said and be happy to take questions. A cross-modal seeing one art form, a striking or memorable painting or play or piece of music, as, or in the terms and affordances of another art form, is a powerful sense-making resource and maybe an instinct, a drive on our part to reintegrate or recombine the modes of sensory experience so that we bring them all back together again. In the course of this seeing as, we often narrativize works which in themselves might seem to give little scope for narrativizing, such as sculpture, paintings, and abstract or non-programmatic music. I've also reported some of the responses of Olivia Comer's MA when she asked relatively naive listeners to comment on what they made of a short passage of Elgar's cello concerto and also of Brian Eno's composition. Because the evidence that came from those respondents seems to suggest some narrativizing that some of her participants were inclined to resort to. And I've tried to review some of the ways in which, despite the difficulties and the subjectivity of the process, people listening to music may find in it many, albeit not all, of the properties that are desiderata of narratives. They find sequence, they often find events of a sort, they think of leading instruments, the solo players and the leading instruments as characters of a sort. They certainly sense a situation being created with lots of emotions around it. They perceive change. People know when a piece has come to an end, I think. They perceive resolution and they certainly sense evaluation. So lots of these features of narrative. And then I've concluded with this thought about the significant contrast between in a sense, the ease, the enthusiasm with which we embrace, these multimodal forms in our everyday experience of art, and the difficulties, the awkwardness when it comes to analysis of trying to keep all these different modes properly appreciated or properly in play, when we resort to writing as a way of trying to capture these things. I did have I think I've got a little time I've got a few more minutes, so you're lucky I didn't do any reading. But I was just at the end of, just at writing some notes after I'd finished my paper, I was thinking again about this question of, which is such a dilemma for anyone who's in any orchestra or choir or whatever. I'm in a choir which is going to be performing Dream of Gerontius in about a month's time, and we worry about our audience. It's so hard to get an audience these days for these kinds of pieces, particularly for my choir, where I think we do this classical choral repertoire, and we almost ought to have a subtitle for our choir. It's called the City of Birmingham Choir. You ought to have a subtitle which says, "Requiems are us," because I'm afraid that's what we mainly do, and for a lot of people, requiems are a bit of a turn-off, So anyway, how do we get how do we get an audience for this live concert? And it's not just us, but really fine orchestras, including the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, the London Symphony, struggle to get a full house these days. Why have concerts? Why go to concerts? Why not have Mirga Grazienta-Tila, our wonderful new conductor, and the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, why not have them perform on their own and upload this to the internet, possibly behind an inexpensive paywall? Pay 10p and you can hear them performing Sibelius's Fifth or whatever. But I think the reason is that at a concert, whether it's a pop concert, classical music, folk or jazz, the multimodality of music is reaffirmed. You see the players and their instruments, their faces and movements, the conductor if there is one. You see the signs of effort on their faces and in their bodies, their attentiveness, their enjoyment, or not sometimes, of the music they're playing. You may be able to smell them. I think, you know, if you think about a jazz club, it smells different from a concert hall, doesn't it, that whether you're hearing Mozart, or for that matter, the smells you might associate with oratorios and requiems performed in cathedrals, which is where we often perform. You may be able to smell them, or the whole environment may smell differently. Sometimes you can touch them. You can get close enough to touch them. And you know you could approach them and touch them. That's the thing. You could approach them. They're not that far away. You could interrupt their playing. You can shout or cough. Coughing is a bugbear, as you know. You can cough in ways that interfere with yours and others' reception of the music. And what you hear is direct and natural. It's not perfected by electronic means for balance or other kind of improvement. It's the real thing. So in a real concert, sight, sound, potential touch, smell, seems to me all the senses, all the sensory modes except perhaps taste, are engaged at so-called live concerts. So-called live concerts. Why don't we just call them concerts anyway? And you, the listener, have a different status as well, as part of an audience, a collective listenership experiencing the music, expected to behave in a particular attentive way before, during, and after the performance. You are less passive, less outside the music than when listening privately to music on your iPhone or your radio or whatever. And with that thought, I will finish. Thank you very much.